And welcome and thank you to the Buffett Center for having me. It's a privilege to be here this afternoon on a day which saw the fulfillment of a promise made more than 145 years ago with the Emancipation Proclamation. We have much to be proud of, but we must also take note that much work remains to be done. Slavery still exists in this country and in scores of countries around the world. In particular, I would like to talk to you today about an exceedingly grotesque, highly profitable component of contemporary slavery, sex trafficking. No form of slavery is nearly as profitable, and it can be argued none is as barbarically exploitive. I've met hundreds of slaves during 8 years of research in more than a dozen countries, and I've met the traffickers, slave owners, and other criminals who exploited them. Beyond trying to raise awareness, I have taken a slightly different approach to this issue, one predicated on a business and economic understanding of the global sex trafficking industry. This approach is not intended to lose sight of the human cost of these crimes. To that end, I would like to start with a story to give you a first-hand sense of what we are talking about. I met Inez at a shelter in the seaside town of Vlora, Albania. With a meek voice and downturned eyes, she told me the following story, which spanned from 1995 to 2003. I was walking to my aunt's house for ironing work when I was kidnapped by 3 men. They closed my eyes, gagged my mouth, and threw me in their car. They said if I try to escape, they will kill me. They drove 1 full day to Gjirokastra, and we went to a hotel. 1 man stayed in the hotel with me. He raped me for 2 weeks. After 2 weeks, we went to Greece in a taxi. He paid money at the border, and the guard let us through. From a village in Greece, we took a bus to Corinth. In Corinth, this man took me to a bar where I saw women in sex work. I tried to protest, but the men in the bar took me to the bathroom and raped me one after the other until I went unconscious. I worked in that bar for 4 months. Most of the men were very cruel. They shouted at me and would beat me if I did not please them. Whatever they wanted to do, I could not say no, or the pimp would torture me. If I was sick or bleeding or in too much pain, I still had to work. I hated this work. I thought, God cannot keep me here forever, and one day I will be free. After 2 years, the pimp took us shopping. I saw a policeman and ran to him. I told him what happened to me, and he took me to the police station. The police put me in a detention cell for 17 days. After this, they deported me to the Kakavija border point. I did not have money, and I told the border guard what happened to me. I asked him to please call my father. The border guard took pity on me, and the next day my father came for me. When I arrived home, my father did not believe me. He said I chose this work, and he denounced me. I had to leave my home. I felt so sad I cried for days, and I wanted to take my life. I slept on the streets 1 week when a man in our village that I had known from my childhood promised to help me find work. I was very cold and hungry, so I went with this man. He took me to Vlora, and very late at night, he sent me and other girls on a speedboat to Italy. He promised me these men would help me find work. When we came to Italy, the men drove us to Torino. They told us we will work in a hotel as cleaning ladies, but in Torino, they took me to an apartment and raped me. They made me take clients in that apartment, then a second apartment. After the second apartment, they took me to Belgium for 3 months. Then they took me back to Italy to Firenze. In Firenze, they left me with a very bad pimp who beat me every day. This is how I got the scar on my forehead. She points to a long gash across her forehead. Sometimes he would beat me until I fainted. I thought this man might kill me, so I tried to escape, but he caught me on the streets and pulled out one of my teeth for punishment. She points to the missing tooth. After Firenze, they sent me to Amsterdam. In Amsterdam, I worked in a closed brothel for 8 months. One day there was a police raid, and they seized the girls because we had false documents. The police put me in detention for 2 months. When they let me go, the same Albanian men who took me from Vlora to Italy were waiting outside the police station. I tried to run back to the police, but they forced me to go with these men. The Albanian men took me to Utrecht and made me work in another closed brothel. At this time, I became pregnant. One of the Albanian pimps said I would have this baby for him, and he would send me back to the brothel. I did not want to give this man my baby, so I ran away to nuns who have a shelter for abused women. I stayed in the shelter until my son was born, and the nuns helped me get documents. I returned to Albania on January 22, 2003. I went back to my family home and showed them my son, but my father shunned me again. Every day I try to forget what I have suffered, but the faces of these men come in my sleep. I'm afraid if they find me, they will send me for sex again. I hate these men. I do not want to sleep with all these men. I do not want these men to kill me. The experiences of Inez are emblematic of the hundreds of thousands of women and children trafficked and forced into prostitution each year. There are a few key points to bear in mind. Poor or marginally subsistent individuals are highly vulnerable to exploitation due to economic desperation. I can actually read with the lights out, if that's easier for people to see. Number two, once acquired, victims are swiftly broken down through physical and psychological torture. Trafficking victims often undergo multiple stops in several countries where they are exploited, resold, and tortured. At each destination, victims are typically told they must work off the debt of trafficking them by having sex with up to 20 men per day. The accounting of these debts is invariably exploitive, involving deductions for living expenses and exorbitant interest rates. For others, no farce of debt repayment is provided. They are simply kept in a state of perpetual forced prostitution. Brothel owners often resell slaves to new exploiters. If the slave does not escape, a cycle of exploitation may never end. Even if they do escape, they often face the same conditions of poverty or vulnerability that led to their initial enslavement, resulting in one or more instances of re-trafficking. In this slide, I have a photo of a piece of art created by Inez while she was living at the shelter in Albania. The totality of my research into the global sex trafficking industry led me to conclude that there are four main deficiencies in current attempts to abolish these crimes. First, despite increased media attention, sex trafficking remains poorly understood. Second, the organizations dedicated to combating sex trafficking are underfunded and uncoordinated internationally. Third, the laws against sex trafficking are overwhelmingly anemic and poorly enforced. Fourth, a systematic business and economic analysis of the industry has not been conducted, designed to identify strategic points of intervention in the business of sex slavery. My book outlines a plan to address these four impediments. I'd like to spend the remainder of this talk outlining some of the key points. The first point to understand is that slavery still exists. By my calculation, there were 28.4 million slaves at the end of 2006. Slaves are broadly defined as individuals who are held captive and coerced to work against their will without compensation. There are many modes by which slaves are exploited, which I have aggregated into three categories: bonded labor, trafficked slaves, and forced labor slaves. Another key point to bear in mind is that the numbers are not static. There is a growth rate associated with slavery, and I calculate almost 29 million slaves at the time of this talk. The overwhelming majority of bonded laborers live in South Asia. The economic model of debt bondage dates back centuries. Individuals borrow money and assets and are bound in servitude until the debts are repaid. This young boy was a child bonded laborer at a brick kiln in India. And these three individuals here will work up to 2 months in dark, cramped quarters to make one 12 by foot 15 carpet as bonded slaves. Forced laborers are more evenly spread throughout the world. They are coerced to work without pay through violence. The line between bonded labor and forced labor can be easily blurred. The more farcical a debt becomes, the more the bonded laborer is actually a forced laborer. These young boys are Roma gypsies, and many such children are forced to beg on the streets of Tirana in the upscale Bloku portion of town. The child lying down had a gash on his head with crusted blood on the sidewalk. I was unable to speak to the boys or get them assistance from local NGOs, but I did manage to give them some wet wipes and some food to eat. Finally, we come to sex trafficking. Understanding the essence of this crime is crucial if we are to design more effective abolitionist tactics. To that end, sex trafficking consists of two components: slave trading and slavery. Slave trading represents the supply side of the sex trafficking industry, slavery the demand side. Combined, these two criminal acts constitute a very sophisticated business. Like any business, sex trafficking has retailers, wholesalers, distributors, and consumers. And like any business, sex trafficking is governed by the forces of supply and demand. In this slide, I've outlined the anatomy of sex trafficking, involving the components slave trading and slavery, and then 3 steps: acquisition, movement, and exploitation. Let me start with acquisition. Acquisition typically occurs in one of 5 ways: deceit, sale by the family, abduction, seduction or romance, and recruitment by former slaves. I've given an example on this page of deceit. Deceit is a false job offer, false marriage offer, any sort of false income generating or life securitizing opportunity that turns out to be a ticket into slavery. This is a newspaper advertisement in a paper called Makler in Moldova. This advertisement and advertisements like it successfully recruit thousands of slaves each year with promises of lucrative jobs in countries as close as Italy or as far away as the United States. The staff at a local NGO told me this particular advertisement was most likely an attempt to secure trafficking victims because it was listed by a travel agency promising a study abroad program, but travel agencies in Moldova aren't licensed to provide study abroad programs. So newspaper advertisements like this are common tactics used by slave traders and organized crime networks to acquire new slaves. Sale by family, conditions of poverty, desperation, and displacement lead many families to sell a child into slavery. Such sales are almost always the heartbreaking decisions parents are forced to make due to extremities of destitution that few Westerners can imagine. In rare cases, there are sales out of greed. Using a startling metaphor, a slave named Tatiana in Italy told me that she was forced to stay into slavery because her parents had grown accustomed to the remittances. And she said, quote, "We are like slot machines to our families." Abduction is not as frequent as a means of acquiring slaves as the mainstream media would have us believe, but it does occur, as it did with Inez and her first bout in trafficking. As ironic as it may sound, seduction is a tool often used. Lover boys or slave traders will find young, vulnerable women, profess love to them, shower them with gifts, and then convince them to migrate to a rich country for a better life. And of course, that turns it into a ticket into slavery. And of course, former slaves, as difficult as it may be to accept, sometimes recruit new slaves. They may spend years in sexual enslavement and just come to accept that life. And then, of course, the slave owner gives them fancy clothes and pockets full of money and says, "Go back to your village and I'll give you a commission for each new person you bring." Okay, the next component is movement. Slaves are moved from countries of origin through transit countries into destination countries. In the case of internal trafficking, the same country acts as origin, transit, and destination. This movement is achieved by almost any conveyance imaginable. I met slaves who are transported by car, bus, train, plane, speedboat, ferry, raft, and by foot. Bribes are paid to border guards and false passports are used to transport individuals almost anywhere in the world. The macro movement of slaves involves transit from poor areas and countries to richer areas and countries. In this picture taken at a village near the Thai-Burmese border, you can see how dense the vegetation is and how easy it is to just pass from one country into another along unguardable border areas. In this next picture I've taken, this is of Vlora Harbor in Albania. Prior to Operation Puna in 2002, several speedboats filled with slaves made the 2 to 3 hour journey to Italy each day in broad daylight. After 2002, trafficking from Vlora was supposed to have stopped, but several locals told me the harbor was still used in the dead of night to traffic slaves to Italy. I, in fact, conducted my own stakeout on the harbor one night and found plenty of activity at the pier. The last component is, of course, exploitation. Exploitation of sex slaves primarily indicates the violent coercion of unpaid sex services, though in essence, exploitation begins the moment the slave is acquired. Slaves are raped, tortured, starved, humiliated, and drugged during transportation. Breaking the spirits of slaves continues once the slave is sold. In Falkland Road, a former sex slave named Malika told me that minors were mercilessly abused when they first arrived, and that they were given opium so that they would have sex with clients. If they misbehaved, arms were broken. If they tried to escape, they might have their throats cut in front of other slaves as a lesson to the others in what might happen should they try to escape. Sex slaves are exploited in 6 primary types of venue. I tracked down some or all in every country I visited. The first is a brothel. Bungalow brothels in Mumbai can possess up to 200 or 300 prostitutes, up to one half of whom might be minors and slaves. Brothels in Thailand typically hold between 20 and 50 slaves, each awaiting selection behind a pane of glass in a room called an aquarium. Club brothels or sex clubs are found primarily in Europe and Asia, such as the one here in Kathmandu, where there are more than 400 dance clubs, the majority of which sell sex with young Nepalese girls. Massage parlors are often used as front organizations for prostitution. In the parlors I visited, I was typically led to a back room or up a flight of stairs where young girls were offered. In the parlor pictured here in Chiang Rai, Thailand, I was taken up a flight of stairs to a locked room where very young female children were told to disrobe to entice selection. When I turned to leave, the manager offered me her best hard sell, 2 children for the price of 1. Apartment brothels are most common in Europe and the United States. The complex pictured here is in Chisinau, the capital of Moldova, where a woman named Ludmila was locked inside an apartment and forced to have sex under threat of torture and starvation. She eventually jumped from the window in order to escape, suffering a broken wrist in the process. Finally, we have hotels and street prostitution. Hotels are less frequently used as venues to exploit sex slaves because the environments are not as secure. Similar to hotels, street prostitution offers ample contact with the outside world and ample opportunity to escape, though few ever do. Here on the Via Ormia in Turin, street prostitutes gather in 3s or 4s every street corner or 2. They're all East European because this is their part of town. Organized crime groups maintain these arrangements as a sort of territorial lease system throughout the city. Nigerians, for example, can always be found on Corso Massimo d'Azeglio near the Parco del Valentino. The fate of sex slaves. As you can imagine, the fate is quite grim. The slaves I met in victim shelters were the bare few who managed to escape, and even their lives offered little hope. Most were infected with HIV, suffered acute drug and alcohol addictions, had been shunned by families, and had little prospects for employment or any form of self-sufficiency upon departure from the shelters. Slaves rarely attempt to escape because brothel owners terrorize them regarding the consequences and threaten violence against family members back home. The fates of an increasing number of sex slaves involves re-trafficking 2, 3, or more times. Because most victims who escape are forced to return to the same conditions of poverty, domestic violence, or lack of economic opportunity that precipitated their initial trafficking, many return to the slave traders who originally deceived them in search of a better arrangement the second time around. Alternatively, many repatriated victims are recruited, deceived, seduced, or abducted into a second or third round of slavery, each time by a different slave trader, just like Inez. Now that we know how the business of sex trafficking works, how do we stop it? Here is the key thesis to bear in mind. The enormity and pervasiveness of the global sex trafficking industry is driven by the ability to generate immense profits at almost no real risk. This, by the way, is on Falkland Road in Mumbai. You're looking at the outside of a pinjara, translated as a cage. It's a small 8 by 6, 8 by 10 room in which 1 or 2 females will typically live. There's 1 or 2 bunk beds in there, and usually an urn of some dirty water that they use to clean themselves after each client. Okay, immense profit. Even though sex slaves comprise only 4% of the total slaves in the world, those same slaves generate approximately 40% of the profits enjoyed by slave owners worldwide. To give you specific numbers, the exploitation of sex slaves for commercial sex generated profits of $35.7 billion in 2007. Total slave profits were $91.2 billion. On the left, I've got revenues, and on the right, I've got profits for each of these categories. Now, compare this roughly $36 billion number, that is the slavery component of sex trafficking, to the $600 million in profits that I calculate were generated in 2007 by the sale of slaves to their exploiters. Trafficked slave profits, that's the slavery component of sex trafficking, and slave trading profits, that's the slave trading component. The profit numbers alone clearly identify which component of the sex trafficking industry must be targeted: slavery. Nevertheless, the global community has primarily focused on the movement connotation of the term trafficking, not the slavery, with interventionist policies focused on thwarting movement across borders, which have met with little result. Here's a little more detail behind these top-line numbers. Note that the average annual profits generated by each form of slavery range from $950 for bonded labor, that's 4 columns from your left, roughly $4,500 for forced labor, and then shaded gray, over $29,000 per slave per year in profits from forced prostitution. If you compare that profit number to my calculation for the global weighted average purchase price of a sex slave of $1,900, the return on investment is staggering, almost 15 to 1. In fact, it's more staggering than you might think. To understand the true magnitude of profits generated by the exploitation of sex slaves, I introduced in the book a concept called the exploitation value of the slave. This metric is not intended to insult the human cost of these crimes, but rather to capture the total value of a sex slave to an exploiter for the computed average duration of enslavement of a sex slave in each region. The details of the calculations are in the book, but this slide provides the top line numbers. To give you an example, a slave can be purchased for roughly $6, $7, $8, up to maybe $10,000 on average in Western Europe. And a slave owner can generate profits in excess of $156,000 before that slave either escapes, is freed, or perishes. Let me now turn to the second half of the very compelling sex slave equation. This was immense profits. Second half is no real risk. Let me explain what I mean by way of example. In India, the only relevant criminal provision for sex slavery is a $44 fine for owning a brothel. This compares to profits of approximately $12,900 per slave per year that can be generated by exploiting sex slaves. That's roughly 3 times the country's per capita income. In Italy and Thailand, there are no fines for exploiting sex slaves. There are always provisions for incarceration, but sentences are relatively short and can often be further reduced by small payments. Even in countries where there are stiff financial penalties stipulated in the law, such as here in the United States and countries like the Netherlands and Albania, the levels of prosecution and conviction of sex slave exploiters are paltry, due in large part to the reasons outlined in this slide. I won't read all that to you, but those are the sort of main drivers of the absence of real risk in the system of sex trafficking. As a result of these reasons, the real risk of exploiting sex slaves is almost nil. That is to say, the costs of exploiting sex slaves are minuscule as weighed against the immense profits that can be enjoyed. Bear in mind, an economic assessment of risk is crucial because at its essence, sex slavery, like all forms of slavery, is fundamentally an economic crime. It seeks to maximize profits by minimizing costs, in this case, the cost of labor. So, what does this economic analysis tell us? I believe the most effective measures to eradicate the global sex trafficking industry are those that reduce aggregate demand for slaves among slave owners and consumers through an attack on the industry's immense profitability. There is clearly considerable demand for sex slaves worldwide. Let me take a moment to address the supply side of the industry so I can explain why I feel the near-term focus should still be deployed against demand. The supply side of contemporary slaves is promoted by ancient factors relating to poverty, military conflict, social instability, lawlessness, and acute bias against gender and ethnicity. These historic supply-side drivers were sharply exacerbated in the post-Cold War era by the policies and governance of economic globalization, whose net result can be seen in this slide. These exacerbations created 3 primary origin regions of contemporary sex slaves: Central and East Europe, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, primarily the Mekong subregion. These results, plus several areas of severe military conflict, rendered tens of millions of people highly vulnerable to trafficking, enslavement, and other forms of exploitation. However, we must not place the entirety of the blame on globalization for the rise in sex trafficking in the 3 regions I noted. Rather, globalization exacerbated historic factors which specifically fueled the supply of potential sex slaves in these regions, namely deep-rooted bias against gender and ethnicity. Throughout my travels, no discovery shocked me more than the extreme level of bias and socioeconomic disenfranchisement faced by millions of women across the globe. These factors contributed directly to female vulnerability to slave traders when the surrounding political and economic infrastructures disintegrated. Beyond systemic bias, the most alarming discovery of my research was the prevalence of violence against women, particularly in rural areas. Countless women I met each day were beaten, treated as male sexual property. In regions where these abuses were most prevalent, I found the most active origins of trafficked sex slaves. Many sex slaves told me that fleeing from these abuses delivered them into the hands of sex traffickers. When I asked these women why they thought men treated them so poorly, Their answers invariably presupposed the necessity of male abuse of females. A young woman in Belts, Moldova, looked at me and said, "When a man beats a woman, you in America call the police, we call it tradition." A brave woman in the Sindhapalchok region of Nepal summarized the truth of the lives of so many rural women in the world when she said, "Men want women as slaves." Similar to gender, minority ethnicities and castes are disenfranchised from economic and educational opportunities, as well as healthcare, social safety nets, and basic rights. In each of the three primary origin regions of sex trafficking, minorities were the most heavily trafficked populations during the socioeconomic upheaval caused by economic globalization. Lower caste individuals rarely found justice when exploited because law enforcement and judicial systems were deeply biased against them. In sum, these global economic as well as socio-cultural supply-side drivers of the contemporary sex trafficking industry will require considerable long-term efforts to redress. However, we do not have to rely on supply-side measures to severely impact, if not virtually abolish, sex trafficking. Remember, for any industry to survive, it requires two forces: supply and demand. Fortunately, the demand side of this industry is highly vulnerable to disruption. The demand side of the sex slave industry can be isolated to three market forces. Number one, consumer demand for commercial sex. Number two, slave owner demand for profit. Number three, consumer demand for lower retail prices, or the price elasticity of demand. Having already discussed point number two, the immense profits, let me focus on the two components of consumer demand, number one and number three. Male sexual demand. There could be no sex slave industry without male demand for commercial sex. While the sex trafficking industry is directly driven by male depravity, greed, and sexual violence, I also believe that the preponderance of males do not condone these vulgarities. Attempts to raise awareness, however, in those males that do want to purchase young women and children for their enjoyment, I think will result in limited impact. Accordingly, I think the focus on consumer demand should be deployed against its economic drivers. A crucial revelation during my research was that without fail, in country after country, the retail price of a commercial sex act was decreasing due to the increased use of sex slaves, in most countries by more than 50% across the last decade. Slaves afford a virtually nil cost of labor. Labor is invariably the highest cost component in any business. With a dramatically reduced cost of labor, total operating costs are substantially reduced, allowing the slave owner to reduce retail prices. This essential economic formula made me wonder, just how little does sex from a slave cost? In every country I visited, I calculated the number of hours of work at that country's per capita income it would take to purchase 1 hour of sex from a slave. Considering demand for sex services in relation to the number of hours of labor required to make the purchase is appropriate because, as Adam Smith pointed out, labor is the real measure of the exchangeable value of all commodities. The real price of everything is the toil and trouble of acquiring it. The results of my calculation varied from roughly 1.5 to a little more than 2 hours of labor to purchase 1 hour of commercial sex from a slave. It is crucial to remember, a decrease in retail price functions the same as an increase in consumer income, allowing consumers to purchase the same product more often, or new consumers to purchase the product where they could not afford it before. As economist John Maynard Keynes wrote, the fundamental psychological law is that men are disposed, as a rule and on average, to increase their consumption as their income increases. So, ask yourselves, how many male consumers will trade in 1.5 or 2 hours of work for 1 hour of commercial sex? The answer is more than enough to create powerful forces of consumer demand, which in turn motivate slave owner demand for more slaves. This aggregate demand among slave owners and consumers is the most deadly driver of the contemporary sex trafficking industry. The logical question to ask is, what would happen to consumer demand if the price instead required 6 or 9 hours of work? What if the price were raised above the threshold of a consumer's monthly disposable income? An economic concept called the elasticity of demand can shed light on these questions. The price elasticity of a product designates the percent decrease in demand for every 1% increase in price. Some products are very elastic, others are not. Using data I gathered at a brothel in Kamatipura, a red light area in Bombay, I constructed a basic demand curve for sex services in this particular brothel. I also plotted the individual's monthly income and expenses to determine the maximum monthly disposable income available to purchase sex. It should be no surprise that sex services in this brothel were highly elastic. A key revelation in the data was that when price doubled from the normal $4 per commercial sex act to $8 per sex act, aggregate demand dropped by almost 80%. A large part of the reduction was due to the fact that when price increased from $5.50 to $6, the day laborers I interviewed were priced out of the market. They only had enough monthly disposable income to purchase one sex act per month at $5.50. What does this mean? It means the most effective measures to eradicate the global sex trafficking industry are those that reduce aggregate demand for slaves among slave owners and consumers through an attack on the industry's immense profitability. An attack on profitability will reduce aggregate demand because slave owners will be forced to accept a lower profit and hence less desirable business, or they will pass the increased cost to the consumer by elevating retail price, which will in turn reduce consumer demand. Recall our key thesis. The enormity of sex trafficking is driven by the ability to generate immense profits at almost no real risk. The most effective way to attack profitability is to elevate real risk. In the book, I call this an inversion of the risk-reward economics of the global sex trafficking industry, and I describe 7 tactics that I believe will accomplish this goal. These tactics must be designed and deployed by a new brand of global abolitionist coalition that I outline, which must possess sufficient unity, expertise, resources, and transnational cooperation to wage a more effective assault on the global sex trafficking industry. Brighter minds will no doubt devise the best tactics, but I hope to spur that analysis with a few suggestions of my own. The 7 tactics I propose are: the creation of an international slavery and trafficking inspection force operationally similar to the weapons inspectors utilized by the United Nations, charged with searching for establishments in which slaves are being exploited, freeing the victims, detaining the criminals. The creation of trained and, in developing nations, paid community vigilance committees consisting of members of the community, taxi drivers, business owners, and specially trained individuals who frequent sex establishments or other slave establishments to seek out slaves and report back to the inspection force or local police. This component is crucial. Individual citizens such as yourself can become the front lines, the moral eyes and ears of a new brand of global abolitionist movement that can elevate the risk and cost of the exploitation of these individuals and, I'm sure, eradicate these crimes. Number 3, we must have targeted, proactive law enforcement raids against establishments for which there is a strong suspicion of slave-like exploitation, with protections in place to minimize the adverse effects against the individuals, slave or otherwise, living in the establishments. Number 4, to obviate the effects of corruption, we must have funding to increase the salaries for anti-trafficking police, prosecutors, and judges. We need special or fast-track courts to prosecute these cases with international observers and participants, as well as judicial review to minimize corruption. We need fully funded witness protection for slaves and their families for the duration of the trial and up to 12 months afterwards, so they can participate in the jurisprudence process without considerable risk or sacrifice. Finally, we need a massive increase in the financial penalties associated with sex slave crimes, perhaps to the level of drug trafficking crimes. This increase, along with increased prosecution and conviction levels that will no doubt be achieved through the above points, should elevate the real risk and cost of sex trafficking to an economically detrimental level. But we can only get there with far more resources deployed in the fight against slavery and far more risk introduced into the system. To that point, let me extend the analogy to the drug wars drawn in point 7. The U.S. government spends 300 times more money per year to fight drug trafficking than it does to fight human trafficking. And the economic penalties for trafficking in cocaine, for example, are roughly 20 times greater than the economic penalties against slavery. But this is where the analogy on the war on drugs ends, because a war on slavery is a war we can win. If someone like me is able to track down slaves and confront their exploiters, then more aggressive interventions and elevated resources can surely bring an end to these grotesque crimes. Slavery is a stain on humankind that must be buried alongside our ugliest demons. I hope you will join me, and I'd like to end with one more narrative shared with me by a young girl I call Susheela in a shelter in Kathmandu called Shakti Samua, which is in fact the first shelter in Asia founded by the former victims of sex trafficking. When I was a young girl, I helped my father work in a rice mill. The owners of the mill had a 20-year-old son who came to my room every night and raped me. I was only 11 years old, so the pain was terrible. My father did not believe me when I told him. Eventually, I could not take it anymore, and I ran away. By evening, I sat in front of a shop, and a woman approached me and said I could work in her hotel. A few days later, she and her husband took me on a bus and gave me ice cream. I fell asleep and do not remember anything after that. When I woke up, I was in another house of a Nepali woman. She took me to a bungalow in Mumbai. There were hundreds of girls in this bungalow. I did not want to go inside, but I was beaten and locked in a room. That evening, the gharwali, the house manager or madam, came to the room and said I was sold for 40,000 rupees, roughly $890. She said I had to do sex work to pay back this money. I told her that I had already been raped and that I could not bear to be with men. I thought no one had touched you, she shouted. I paid the virgin price. She burned me with cigarettes and beat me with a wooden ladle. I was back in black and blue, and my entire back was bruised. I cried the entire night. The next day, another prostitute told me if I wanted to eat, I should start to work. I told her I would rather starve. After 4 days, another woman from the Mahato caste tried to convince me. I still refused. After 1 week, a Japanese man came. They had made an arrangement for me with this Japanese man for 60,000 rupees. They told him I was a virgin. The Japanese man stayed with me for 2 weeks. I was forced to be with him, even though the pain was unbearable. 4 days after the Japanese man left, another customer came. I was still bleeding, so the man went to the gharwali and shouted, "Why did you send me to a woman having her period?" The gharwali asked me if I was having my period, but I told her it was from the wounds inside my vagina. The malik, or brothel boss, called the doctor, and he stitched my wounds. I was given rest for 3 days, then I was forced to be with customers. My stitches opened, and I started to bleed again. This process happened 12 times. I do not know how many years I was in Kamathipura. I used to be with 25 customers a day. If we felt we would faint from the pain, the gharwali gave us medicine. We had to keep making sex with customers no matter what. When the Indian police conducted a raid in January 1996, they found me. After the rescue, I was kept in a shelter for 7 months. The Nepalese government would not allow us to return. They said, "The prostitutes are a reservoir of AIDS from India who will spread the disease in Nepal." With the help of NGOs, we were finally allowed to return to Nepal. They flew us back on 2 planes. The people in Nepal came to the airport and spat on us. They said they would contract AIDS just by touching us. I was lucky not to have AIDS, though I had other sexually transmitted diseases. I am still on medication. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we have an opportunity for a discussion, and I welcome questions. Yeah, right back here, please.
Hi, my name is Macy, and I've actually done some work in Bolbazar and Kolkata in India with some women, some of the children actually living in the brothel area. And I guess my question is, what motivates you, or what started your interest in this issue?
Actually, it goes back to the mid-1990s. I had put together a project with some graduate students. I was an undergrad at Duke University. And I put together a project with some graduate students and faculty sponsors to volunteer in refugee camps in the former Yugoslavia. As you may recall, mid-90s, things were fairly difficult there, and there was a lot of violence going on. In fact, the motivation to do that is an interesting story. I was watching CNN one night. It was close to first semester examinations, and they were spotlighting the story of this young Croatian girl. She was 14, 15 years old. She was a championship swimmer, breaking records across Europe, and hopes were high. She was from Croatia, that she would go to the Atlanta Olympics and bring home the new country's first gold medal. But there was a bombing one night, and shrapnel shattered her legs, and she'd never swim again. And I thought, here I am complaining about my first semester examinations. I think it was my junior year, and here's someone who had a talent that put her in the top 0.001% of people, and her life was over, and her talent wouldn't be fulfilled. So I was young, I was ideological. I thought, well, I'm going to go make a difference. So I put together this project. We went to this refugee camp in Slovenia, actually, filled with Bosnian Muslims. And I heard a lot of terrible stories, as you can imagine, one of which involved Serbian soldiers who would come into villages, execute the men, round up the women and young females, and traffic them to brothels throughout Central Europe, throughout the Balkan region. So this is the first time I came across sex trafficking. Now, it was many years later. I was in New York finishing my MBA degree, and I realized no one was really investigating this effectively. No one was understanding how these crimes work. And I looked at the paths before me, go back into the corporate sector, or maybe apply my skills somewhere else. And I made a decision and started my first research trip summer of 2000.
Yes, please.
I was looking at the 7 points that you mentioned, and I was thinking about that could be F point, that is to work directly on the incentive of the women workers to escape. By that I mean two things. First is the job opportunity for them to get out. The second thing is to remove the stigma when they get out. Right. So on the first point, I thought of 3 things on top of my head. First is to ask you, what are the job opportunities for this woman? Second thing is, why don't we employ these women, ex-workers, to work for the law enforcement or inspection themselves and pay them, so like a paid business, right? And the third thing is that, because most of these people, as you mentioned, are refugees or don't have legal status, right? So it could be like a good thing that we push for kind of a legalization status, for working status, job status for these slaves, right? So 3 points for the job opportunity. The other thing is the stigma, removing the stigma for these women to get out of it, right? Is that there used to be like a huge stigma on HIV patient, right? And in past 10 years, that stigma pretty much been reversed in many countries, including my country, Vietnam, right? So I was thinking, like, could do like kind of public process like that to remove this idea of women. So
yeah,
I just want to.
Those are very, very crucial points. The idea of vocational training, education, or employment opportunity for anyone who's either vulnerable to being exploited or has been exploited and is trying to get a life going again. These are sort of supply side measures, clearly. And a lot of NGOs are doing great work on this kind of thing already, many of whom I talked with and met with through the course of my research. These are crucial activities that will help address the supply side and evaporate some of the vulnerabilities that lead to trafficking to begin with, and of course help people get their lives going again should they actually manage to get free, find a shelter, and move on. One of the main deficiencies in these efforts is a lack of resources. That's why I really call for a fundamentally resource-driven response, both to supply and demand side tactics. A lot of these shelters can only allow women to stay for a few months because there's more, they have too few beds. A lot of the sort of microcredit or other initiatives or educational initiatives are, again, resource constrained. They could make do much more good. As for stigma, that's a difficult one. There are intense biases against gender and ethnicity in so many parts of the world, and in particular, women who have been quote-unquote involved in sex work, whether they were coerced or forced or raped or whatever, all of the above. And there are, again, a lot of NGOs that are on the front lines in rural areas trying to educate, trying to raise awareness. It's an uphill battle, but there are a lot of good groups doing a lot of good work, and we can only hope that with time, more and more people will be enlightened. But those are long-term efforts that must be undertaken. In the short term, we've got to eliminate the exploitation of these individuals right now. And that's why I'm really focusing in the near term on the demand side, understanding that the long-term measures must be undertaken as well.
So I noted your analogies to the drug war, and you said that, of course, it's very different in so many ways. But so many of your points were focused on enforcement. And this is kind of similar in some ways to the stigma question, but I mean, in terms of for the individuals who are in slavery, I mean, how do you, what sort of policy recommendations would you make in terms of decriminalizing the situation for the individuals who are in slavery compared to the enforcement? I mean, how do you balance that out and meet those two goals simultaneously?
Well, again, intervention has to be intelligent, and it has to involve protections in place to avoid the further abuse of individuals who are already being exploited. Right? A lot of times you may hear about raids where police go in, and of course they round up the women and prosecute them as prostitutes, and the owners pay a little bit of bribe and they go back to business. Okay, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about something that would have to have a transnational basis so that interventions are conducted in an intelligent way in conjunction with local NGOs that are part of a global system that have counseling, female officers, individuals in place to immediately supply protections for the people inhabiting these establishments, even as the criminals are rounded up. And before all of that, of course, we need sophisticated investigation, the kind that goes into organized crime investigations, electronic surveillance, data gathering, so that the prosecutions can be successful and result in convictions. Right now, the barest minimal 1-2% of individuals involved in these crimes might be prosecuted in a year. They pay a bribe, they pay a fine, they're back on the streets. Jail terms are short, fines are minuscule. And of course, witnesses are terrorized into not being involved in the jurisprudence process. If you talk or testify, I know where your family lives. So that's why I called for protections, not just for the slave, but the families as well, with income and remittances provided for them so they can survive to participate in the jurisprudence process. So the interventions have to be intelligent. The concept of intervention is a controversial one for some of the reasons I've talked about, but the business requires daylight impunity to survive. And this is a major difference between the drug industry. There has to be an intersection between slave owner and consumer in broad daylight where the consumer can find the slave, find the establishment. And that point of intersection is where we need to intervene. That's the point of intervention, right there, at the retail, the establishment, where the slave is being exploited. People say, well, if you have raids and interventions and police, you'll push it further underground. I don't buy it for a minute, because the industry requires visibility to have consumers come in and make the purchase and thrive. They're not going to go down underground into the boonies and nether regions to try to track down the least expensive commercial sex act.
Yeah, I have a question. I mean, which is also common. I'm from Italy. I'm interested especially in labor slavery into Italy. There's been cases you're probably familiar with. But one of the things that Italy has done on the legislative side is to allow prostitutes and trafficked women to denounce their exploiters, and they would have a permit of stay in Europe as a sort of reward to that. But that is, and I think this really feeds into your proposal, which I think is brilliant, to have resources. The Italian government has left this process of denunciation into the hands of the church. So basically these women end up being criminalized because they have to denounce their trafficker, yes, with the police, but they also have to go through a process of redemption. This is how it is called. And they basically have to, demonstrate that they're ready to face the new society, that they have, there's a sense in which they're criminalized again. But one interesting thing that came out in studies I have read about this, that many Nigerian women, first of all, their exploiters were women, not men. And I wonder if you have encountered that as well. The exploiters are not always men. But they always were kept into slavery with the threat of religious spells on them. Have you
right? Yeah. Yes. Two things. Many countries tie visas or the ability to stay in the country with participation in the investigations and jurisprudence process without providing protections or sufficient protections. And this is a problem. Now, that was a problem recently remedied here in the U.S. under the Wilberforce Act, the Trafficking Victim Protections Reauthorization Act 2008, which disaggregated benefits from signing the dotted line that you will participate in investigations. This was a major plus. Other countries have yet to do that. Italy and many European countries should. You bring up an interesting point about Nigerians. I talk about this in the book. They undergo a very unique and different type of acquisition and enslavement. The largest ethnicity of sex slaves in Italy aren't Europeans, right next door. They're actually Nigerians, and they are almost 90% of them from one ethnic group, the Edo, in the southern, southwestern region. And they undergo these juju rituals, where a local priest takes some of their hair, menstrual blood, and forces them to take an oath that you're going to go to Italy, you're going to work, and you will not talk about it, you will not tell anyone, you will not try to escape until you've repaid your debt. And then, of course, they're trafficked up into Italy and auctioned. And it's females who purchase them, these madams. And they're not purchasing the slave, they're purchasing the spiritual control. It's a really unique thing. And they're given the juju sack, which conveys the control over to the madam. Now, these individuals are terrorized of the physical and spiritual affliction that will fall upon them should they try to escape or should they testify in courts. I talked to a prosecutor in Turin who said, I've tried to bring cases, but when we bring the women up to the stand, rather than testify, they go into fits. They suffer trances. They won't do it. So this is, again, a very difficult and very unique aspect of the global sex trafficking industry. It's very prevalent in Italy. It's spreading to other European countries. It's actually spreading to East Asia. My first trip to Thailand was in 2000. I then took a trip in 2005. In those 5 years, I saw something that I never thought I'd see, which was Nigerian street prostitutes in Bangkok, all the way from Nigeria. So this is something that the Italians are definitely struggling with, and a lot of good NGOs are trying to work through this very unique and difficult issue.
Mm-hmm. Yes, please.
Can you speak to the Dutch model, I guess, of sex work, and I guess less so in Nevada and the United States, and why you wouldn't advocate spreading that model to other places?
Yeah. Two European countries provide very interesting case studies, Sweden and the Netherlands. And they took polar opposites on the debate of legalization or criminalization. Sweden in 1999 passed a groundbreaking law. They criminalized prostitution. They criminalized the solicitation of sex under the logic that in a democratic society you can't have prostitution because it only promotes the subordination of women. Now, preliminary data has shown that there's less trafficking into Sweden and more into its neighbors, Denmark and Norway. Again, it's preliminary data, but it seems that criminalization has introduced some risk and expense in the system that is demotivating this business from thriving there. Amsterdam took the opposite, and the Netherlands took the opposite approach. In 2000, they legalized brothels under the logic that legalization would provide protections for people. You can have health care, you can have retirement benefits, you can have police checkups, etc., etc. Well, it didn't really work out that way, or at least the preliminary information seems to indicate it didn't work out that way. Across the last 7 or 8 years, there's been a mass influx in foreign women in the red light area of Amsterdam. Many of them are trafficked. And what seems to have happened is legalization provided a veneer behind which deeper exploitation could occur. You can terrorize a slave into saying to any police officer, no, I'm here by choice, I do this is my vocation, and I enjoy it, right? What is the policeman going to do? So the result has been so antithetical to the logic that the Dutch authorities thought they were implementing that just recently the mayor of Amsterdam said, we might reverse this policy. It seems to be actually promoting exploitation and not protecting sex workers, as they're called there.
Well, actually, I wanted to follow up on this very question because it does seem that one way to raise the cost would be to treat this as a matter of labor standards. I mean, I understand the point you're making. It's whenever you're talking about coercion, talking about labor standards in the same sentence doesn't always work. But it seems like at least theoretically, your point about increasing the cost could be accomplished through treating it as a labor question where you try to costs of doing business, such that, you know, demand would go down to some extent. But I guess, you know, the other thing that I find troubling is the whole question of how you would even get resources to do any of the things we're talking about. And I mean, it seems to me that at some level this is all about political will, which takes you back to the drug question. I mean, we poured billions of dollars into that without a whole lot of success, given that the demand is there. So I guess I feel like there are certain kinds of, you know, persistent problems of demand and resources and will that maybe are not.
Yeah. Well, so 2 points. You know, on the labor thing, you know, this was the logic that the Dutch authorities employed, and you know, the problem is unless you're in every one of these establishments all the time with non-corrupt individuals trying to enforce these labor standards, exploitation seems to happen. Now, this is a hotly contested debate. I don't presume to have the crystal ball here, but I can report back what, you know, some of the experiments out there have been. And again, if you had the resources and the political will to be in all of these places at all times, ensuring that there's no exploitation happening, maybe that would work. To the question of resources, it doesn't take that much to root out slavery. And this is, again, a massive difference between the slave industry, particularly sex slavery, and the drug industry. Sex slavery requires that visible point of intersection between retailer and consumer that drugs do not. Okay? Sex slavery is a much more simple supply chain. Person is moved to a place where they're exploited. That's it. Okay? If I can find slaves, anybody, leave alone a sophisticated interventionist force, can track down slaves. So what are the resources? I actually have, briefly I talk about it in the book, and I've fleshed out in more detail separately, you know, what would this new abolitionist coalition look like? Well, there'd be 2 units, you know, of an extra governmental force. One would deal specifically with victims, dealing with the supply side issues, and also with assisting those who have managed to escape with more robust medical care, psychological care, vocational training, etc. Okay, that unit requires about $65 million a year. All right, the other unit is one that would deploy the 7 tactics or tactics like them, specific interventionist tactics on the establishments, and that unit, including increasing salaries of prosecutors, judges, etc. in these developing nations. A prosecutor in Moldova makes $150 a month. A judge makes $200 a month. A slave owner can make $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 a year per slave. He can give them 1 year's income and won't even notice the cost of business, right? So, elevating salaries, internationalizing, and fast-tracking the courts with judicial review is another thing we'll fund. That second unit would require around $350 million a year. So that's $400 million. No, to start off and spread across the world, okay? That's $400 million per year. We spend $1.5 billion a day on defense. A few days of that would fund several years of a more robust abolitionist coalition.
I'll get you next.
3 kind of disparate aspects of intervening that you raised. One has to do with the frequency that parents are the sort of the mechanism for enslavement. And I don't know if there's good data on that or not, but it seems to me that some of your prescriptions would vary in a sense if that really is the root of much of the sex slave trade. I guess I'd be interested, do we know anything about that? A second thing is, as a mechanism, would foreign aid policy play any role in the sense that we try to direct foreign aid to countries based upon the characteristics of their governance, for instance? Would we want to advocate for doing that on the basis of their treatment of sex slavery? And then I guess the last thing is you emphasize financial penalties, and I wonder why you don't mention imprisonment as also an important kind of component of this and deterrent.
Okay, let me work backwards, and if I forget, just remind me. We've got prison terms. They are relatively short. Yes, you can increase them, but the massive difference we need to make is in the level of economic penalties associated with these crimes. It's just too low. And it's too low because no one really knew what are the profits these people are making. I mean, there were a couple of numbers thrown out there. The U.S. State Department first it threw out $9.5 billion, then it threw out $14 billion, but it didn't say what that number was, and it didn't say whether it was revenues or profits and what it applied to. So we don't know. The ILO came out with a number, 32 billion in profits from slaves, with some analysis associated with it. So that was a step in the right direction, but we still didn't know, well, what are the real unit economics of various forms of slavery, so that we can tie the penalties more accurately with the type of slavery we're dealing with. So part of the logic of what I've tried to do is put out a bottom-up calculation of each type of slavery and the profits made in each region in the world, so that policymakers, legislators, whoever can look at it and say, oh boy, here's the benefit, here's the cost we've put in the system, that's out of whack, let's get this lined up better. Okay, now working back, you had foreign aid. The U.S. has tinkered with this. Every year in June it puts out the TIP report, Trafficking Persons Report, and in theory, if you're on Tier 2 watch list or Tier 3 long enough, they can withdraw foreign aid as a penalty. It's been a threat that's never been implemented. I think the primary reason, do you want to negatively impact all the other people who really need that aid in that country, just to focus on the penalizing a country for not more adequately addressing slavery? But foreign aid could be used as a carrot as opposed to a stick, I think. Elevating foreign aid for countries that institute certain measures or policies or tactics, root out corruption in the judiciary, whatever. So, I'd take the carrot approach. And then your first point was?
Parental pimping.
Well,
how frequent?
Yeah, I mean, look, deceit is used more than anything else because it's so easy. You can go into a refugee camp in Thailand or in Kosovo several years ago, and individuals can't work, they can't go anywhere, they don't have permits and whatever, and you say, hey, I can get you a job in Bangkok, you'll make $20 a week or whatever, send it back here for your husband and children, no problem. Who would say no, right? Let's say you're a battered or abused woman in a Nepalese village. So deceit is the most common tactic used. It's economic desperation, in my experience, that drives most of the sales of children, particularly in South Asia, Central and East Europe. So the best way, I think, to deal with that is some of the supply side measures, economic development, a more equitable governance of globalization, so that third world countries, developing countries, have a more sustainable level of profit participation in global commerce, so that they have access to markets, other things that we need to do to give them a more sustainable life. The last 18 years has been predicated, 18, 19 years has been predicated on a massive widening between rich and poor through these unfettered market economy principles thrust upon the developing world after November 1989. And those same unfettered market economy principles have come home to roost in the last year or two. We've seen the impact here. We're seeing it right now. Okay, and imagine in a country that's already bankrupt, already impoverished, already lacks social safety nets, if you introduce economic collapse to them, the results are disastrous.
Question here.
I just first wanted to say thank you. That was a really clear and compelling presentation that provides a model, I think, for graduate students for useful scholarship and really drives home the question of why isn't anything being done? Why is this happening? It really drove that home well. And along those lines, I was wondering if you could talk more about the laws. You mentioned that there are laws against trafficking, that there should be laws against slavery, if I heard that right. And I was wondering what kind of laws exist besides what you told us about in Sweden, laws against prostitution, and if there are problems. I mean, if there's a reason sort of that you can identify, I guess you're kind of alluding to these problems of globalization and maybe people just not catching up, but why isn't anyone doing anything?
Well, hopefully, intelligent, motivated people such as you will cry out, and people will be doing something. No, there are laws against slavery, and slavery is illegal everywhere in the world. Okay, and every country, especially recently, has developed laws dealing with trafficking, but they're completely imbalanced from a penalty standpoint to the benefits of these types of crimes. So what I'm calling for is a balancing or an elevating of the risk to meet what the benefit is. So that was your first point, or your first question. And then why isn't anyone doing anything? Well, it's hard to wonder why slavery is clearly a moral outrage. Anyone who hears about it doesn't want to stand for it. It hasn't captured enough, I guess, public attention. It hasn't captured enough political attention to be elevated on the agenda. And there was a lot of talking in the last 8 years, but not a lot of doing. And we need to get to the stage where we match the talking with the doing. That speaks to resources. It speaks to public outcry. And it speaks to really a more massive response to these crimes. So once and for all, we can root out something that we agreed 145 years ago we wouldn't tolerate.
The question right here.
How much of the problem in terms of developing a political world for enforcement is tied up with the fact that in a lot of these economies, not just sex trafficking and slavery, but sex work in general is such a huge percentage of the local economy. And you mentioned the bribes that easily sway any beat cop's opinion in a second or prosecutor.
Yeah.
So how do you approach that when there are also laws against sex work in a lot of these countries, but it's not the same sort of moral outrage, right?
Yeah, look, prostitution is illegal in Thailand, but you can't look in one direction or another without seeing it. It's illegal in Moldova, but 5 minutes after I checked into my hotel in Chisinau, there's a knock on the door from a prostitute. I was like, how did she even know I was here? Well, she was at the bar next door, and whenever a single man or a group of men check into the hotel calls the bar, and they send over So, there's systems in place to monetize commercial sex, even where it's illegal. So you're absolutely right. There's money to be made, which leads to corruption. This is why I think if we fundamentally focus on the economics of demand, okay, and internationalize the intervention and really deploy considerable resources in the next 10 years, we can make a tremendous impact. And, markets then redefine themselves, where something is suddenly not nearly as enticing and lucrative and easy and interesting to a criminal, they shift. They shifted to this industry in the last 15 years because they saw this tremendously opportunistic and friendly market atmosphere. So we need to change that atmosphere. We need to poison the gas, okay? Poison the air that they breathe so that they want to leave the room, to use a very contorted metaphor.
What about prosecuting consumers? What do you think of?
Hotly contested. Sweden does it. Some other countries do it. Other countries don't. So I think if you want to start to institute policies specifically designed to erode sex slavery, you have to consider the criminalization of solicitation because it's about introducing risk and cost in the system at that point of intersection.
Question right over here, please.
You gave an awesome presentation.
Thank you.
I just had a small question, which is, how would you establish exactly a legal framework for such a? I mean, for example, you talked about how in the Netherlands a general permissibility of prostitution has actually led to an increase in problem. But I think that, and whereas criminalization in Sweden has led to evidently a decrease. Is it not a little dangerous to put a full blanket ban on the question? I mean, I don't actually know very much about Southeast Asia, but I do know something about Israeli trafficking. And what happens is, first of all, most of the women that are trafficked through do not have status as residents of the country. And second of all, as prostitutes, they are officially illegal. So even if a prostitute escapes from a brothel, which by the way is an ordeal already nearly impossible, they go to the cops, and the cops basically deliver them back to the bordello order because there's absolutely nothing they can do to them but throw them in prison otherwise. So I guess what I'm saying is, would an international agency to deal with this, how effective would it be in establishing kind of an international legal framework for the question? Because it would involve statutes in every single country involved change.
Well, countries can sign on to sort of international types of documents and agreements. and agreeing to sort of a framework for dealing with this. Now, it can be instituted differently on a local level, but the pitch I'd make is, if you're genuinely serious about rooting out slavery, and I'm not sure why you wouldn't be, so if you're genuinely serious about rooting out slavery, here is the framework you have to sign on to. And here's what you have to agree to. And here we're going to help with the resources to do this. And we're going to show you how to intervene effectively. You can do it on your own. You can bring in international folks, however you want to do it, if you're resource constrained. But these are the steps that have to be taken if you want to significantly deal with this problem.
I guess the problem I have is that sometimes international frameworks can actually get in the way of local legal procedure, and sometimes they go parallel with each other, and sometimes they don't. And what I'm saying is, I guess to some extent, would it not be better? Well, who am I to question? But I mean, is there any way to establish a system in which each government working in tandem with an international organization, because they have a much, I think, better local understanding of what's going on, whether or not they deal with it, would it not be better? Would it not be a good way to kind of figure out an international organization that could consult countries in how to fix them? Because, for example, in Israel, legalizing, because it's not a huge volume of sex slaves, but they're also extremely badly treated, maybe, say, considering the sex trafficker as a corporation, which requires a massive amount of taxes, because in Israel the corporate taxes are massive, would knock them out of the business, whereas in another country it would take something else.
No, I think clearly you have to look at local factors, because the supply and demand factors in each country, the legislative climate, the economic climate are different in each country. But there have to be some sort of agreed upon benchmarks and bedrocks that you put a stake in the ground and say, here's where we're drawing the line, and working individually or regionally to address local factors. There's a coalition called Commit, the Coalition to something, I forget, in Southeast Asia. Now, this was signed by countries as different as the US and Cuba. Okay, it's China, it's Vietnam, it's Thailand, it's Malaysia, it's Indonesia, it's all these Mekong sub-region countries. And they agreed on, here's how we define slavery. Here's how we're going to deal with slavery. We're going to set up an international trafficking force to deal with this. We're going to deal with each other. One of the ways slave owners escape prosecution is they just hop over a border. There's no extradition relationship between one country or another. There's no cooperation and investigations, and that's it. Everything falls apart. You can't have that. You have to have something that would be like Commit, but more resource-driven and more scaled, because it's a global crime. You have slave traders that are dealing from Peru to Japan, from Africa to East Asia and Europe, and you've got to be able to have some sort of unified standards so that they can't find the weakest environment to flee to and then evade prosecution and conviction.
So an international organization would have or universally defined objectives, but would have different methodology.
Something like that, yeah.
Very good. With that call for international action, I'm going to bring our session to a close. I'd like to have you please join me in thanking Siddharth Kara for a terrific, compelling presentation.